We had some good questions that I just want to answer real quick. The lady in the white, you had some questions.
Oh, right. So, as I'm hearing you talk about these sellers, the first thing that comes to mind is, are these people, normally they want to sell their house, right? That's why it's on the market. So they really don't want to be a landlord. So when you're bringing up lease option, it kind of keeps them in the transaction, and in the back of their mind, they're thinking, landlord or property manager. So are you dealing with people who are already kind of on that mindset of, yeah, I may have to rent this house if this thing doesn't sell? And then the second piece of that was, do they not need their equity or their loan out of their name in order to move on with their life and go buy something else?
So there's two questions. The first one was, when you're talking to a seller, they don't want to be a landlord. They'd like to just sell it and be rid of it. And number two, do I talk to them about, if you do rent this house out, can you get another mortgage to buy another house? So many times, one thing I always tell people is sometimes you have to dig through a lot of dirt to get to the gold. Sometimes you may have to talk to 20, 25 sellers before you get a deal under contract. It's just a numbers game. And I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. Yes?
You mentioned it Wednesday night, but you want to talk about how many people you sent the outgoing marketing to?
Yeah, I'm going to be showing a spreadsheet. The question was, I have a spreadsheet I'm going to show you how many sellers you need to talk to. This is really cool to get a deal under contract, right? So you got to understand, not every seller is going to say, yeah, this doesn't fit for everybody. This is so important to understand. Pay attention. Write this down. Okay? Never beg for business. You are the buyer. Okay? You're not the seller. The seller needs to sell you on their house. They need to convince you why you need to buy it. Okay? So when I talk to sellers, and I'm going to be showing this in a minute, I approach it as, do you mind, I'm an investor. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions to see if I'd even be interested in making an offer on your house? Tell me about the house. Tell me about your situation. I'm only asking questions. I used to make the mistake of going on this long sales pitch, this long, all the benefits of lease purchasing, yada, yada. I sounded like a salesman. I was getting no over and over again. And I always felt like I don't know if any of you have ever tried to sell things for a living. And sometimes it's tough. It's hard. Like I feel like I'm begging. I realize the faster you chase them, the harder you chase them, the faster they'll run. Right? So I stopped doing that. I'm not on the phone any longer than 3 minutes with the seller, sometimes 5. I find out right up front, listen to this, is important. You're in business to make money today. Okay? You're in business to make money today. If a seller's bringing up these objections, I just say, you know what, this probably isn't for you. That's okay. I'm sorry, I don't want to waste your time. So I am off the phone immediately with these sellers. You know what? It does something amazing. It actually draws them back into what you have to offer. They realize real quick, I'm not selling anything, so I'm playing the role of the reluctant buyer. I'm playing the role of the reluctant buyer. I'm not selling them on anything. So I'll ask them questions like, if they say, well, I don't want to be a landlord. I say, great. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the house? Oh, it sounds like a nice house. Why on earth would you want to sell it? Well, I got family down in Florida. I need to go. They give me their reasons why. I always try to dig down to why they need to sell it. It's not money. There's always a deeper reason why they need to sell their house. So I don't find out why they want to sell their house. I find out why they need to sell their house. All right? Once I find out that they need to sell it because they got a mother that is sick, they needs their help, okay, that's why they need to sell it. I say, oh, I can understand. So, but sounds like you got it priced right. You got a great realtor working for you. Why haven't you sold it yet? I know the reason why, but I want them to tell me. I'm just asking questions, okay? Well, it's overpriced. I owe too much. The realtor's not working hard enough. You get all these reasons why. I always come to the realtor's defense. I say, well, I'm sure they're doing their best, I mean, what's really going on? Why can't you sell this house? Well, I just need too much for it. I say, oh, okay. Well, have you ever thought about what are you going to do if you can't sell this house? How long can you wait? I'm sure you got 6 months of savings in the bank. You can keep on making mortgage payments. And they said, well, no, I can't wait that long. Oh, man. So my wife would kill me if I had to make payments on 6 months on a vacant house. I kind of chuckle and I play with them a little bit, but I'm getting them to sell me on why I should buy their house. Well, I got to sell this thing. So what are you going to do if you can't? Have you thought about that? Well, I don't know. I'm just going to probably have to rent it out. Okay. So are you going to rent it to a tenant, or would you rather rent it to somebody who wants to buy it? Do you want to rent it to somebody who's going to trash it, call you every time the faucet leaks? Or would you rather rent it to somebody who wants to buy it and who's going to take care of all the maintenance and repairs? Well, I'd rather rent it to somebody who wants to buy it. So help me understand this. Sounds to me like you got a few options, Mr. Seller. You can offer your house, drop the price $20,000 and sell it probably pretty quickly. Would you be prepared to do that? Can't do that. All right, so you could do a short sale, stop making payments. No, that would ruin my credit. Okay, well, what else could you do? I could lower my price out. I could rent it out. Okay, have you ever been a landlord before? Do you understand the problems with this? I don't want to be a landlord. Okay, Mr. Seller, look, what if I could show you how to lease your property to somebody who wants to buy it, who's going to be responsible for all the maintenance and repairs, who's going to buy it at the end without you having to pay a commission? Now, it depends on if I'm a realtor, I don't say that, or if there's a realtor involved, I don't say that. But you can sell it for full retail, and you can get a tenant who can take care of all of the maintenance and repairs. That wouldn't be of any interest to you, would it? Well, maybe. That sounds like a good idea. So if they come back to me with, and this is still answering your question, they come back to me with, well, I need to sell it. I say, great. Why haven't you sold it yet? What's your plan if it doesn't sell? I'm asking questions. I'm not spouting off all the benefits of lease purchasing. I phrase it as questions. And I think the second question was, what if they need to sell it to buy another house? Well, I make sure before they enter into a lease option agreement that the seller has talked to a mortgage broker to see if they can buy another house. Okay? But that's not my responsibility for them to figure it out. Many times the seller has already figured that out. They've already talked to a mortgage broker, or they've already come to the realization that they can't buy another house. So I'm not ever trying to convince them to do something they don't want to do. And many times if a seller keeps on bringing up objections, I just say, well, look, this probably isn't for you. That's okay. But remember, I'm in business to make money today. So I'll ask a seller, if I could do all this, what would you want to do then? Is there any reason why we couldn't do business today? If they say they need time to think about it, I'll say, look, honestly, Mr. Seller, when people tell me they need to think about it, they're just being really polite and they're just saying no. That's okay. It's okay to say no, this probably isn't for you. I am super busy right now. I don't want to be wasting your time. I'm sorry. I got a bunch of buyers right now looking for homes, so I got some other sellers I can call. So we're playing the reluctant. I'm using negative phrasing, okay? It's powerful when you learn this stuff. Okay, and it really does work. So before, when I was first doing this, I had to talk to 20, 25 sellers to get a house under contract. Now it's like 15 to 20, sometimes 10. You'll get better at it as you learn, as you go through this. But it is really, really awesome when you learn the power of just asking simple questions. Okay, do those answer your two questions?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, there was another question. Yes, sir.
Can we hire you to talk to our sellers?
The question was, can you hire me to talk to your sellers? No. Unless you want to hire me as a consultant. I tell you what I do with my students. When I talked about it Wednesday night, and I'll talk about it more here, is I'll partner with you on deals. So if you get a house under contract, I'll show you the property information worksheet. If you get it under contract, I will partner with you on it, and we'll sign a JV agreement. We'll split the profits 50-50. But I will help you with all of those steps involved. I can't partner with you on a deal until you get it under contract, because I don't have the time to handle all of those requests. But once you learn what to say to sellers and to phrase the questions the right way, that's my script. I used to be all fancy, like if they say no, then say this, and I had all of these comebacks, or answers to their objections. And now it's just I just ask questions. Okay. Was there one more question? Then we'll move on. Yes, sir.
What if it's listed with the realtor? Might not the seller refer you exclusively to the realtor?
If it's listed with a realtor, what do you do? Well, it depends. Many times I find that homeowners are advertising the houses on their own, so I'm responding to an ad that they put in Craigslist to sell their house or whatnot. I don't go after homes that are listed. I could, because I'm not a realtor. There's nothing that says I can't send a postcard to a listed house that says, hey, do you want to lease purchase your home? In fact, this is a little controversial. Some people do that. But here's if you do that, if you send direct mail to listed properties, make sure you don't tell the seller to cancel their listing agreement with the realtor. All right. But what I tell the sellers who have contacted me, I don't intentionally go out and contact listed properties. But many times the seller is advertising it for sale by owner, and so the sellers contact me, but it's already listed. I tell them, look, don't cancel your listing agreement with your agent. We can work with your agent. I tell them, look, I don't want to talk to your agent. What you're doing with them is totally between you two, okay? But if you want to do a lease purchase, you can sign a lease purchase agreement with me, but you need to work out with your realtor how the commissions will work out. I don't talk to the realtor. You work it out with them. And after you talk to them, then get back to me. Sometimes the realtor will say, heck no, you can't do that, and we'll get all upset, you know. And if the realtor gets upset, I just walk away from the deal. It's not worth it. But many times the realtors, they want what's in their client's best interest. And they say, well, okay, this happens all the time. If a seller can't sell a house, the agent, if they can't sell the house, the seller will say, hey, I need to rent this thing out. So they'll modify the listing agreement to also advertise it for sale, and then the realtor will usually only get 1 month's rent as a commission. But if the realtor understands if you do a lease purchase, you can still get your full 3%. Maybe you only get 1 month's rent now and get the rest if and when the house sells down the road. So if the house is listed, I sign a lease purchase agreement with the seller. I tell the seller, you need to go talk to your realtor and work out a new commission agreement with them, okay? And so many times it's too difficult to work with. And so I just go after the low-hanging fruit, and I don't chase those deals too hard. If there's a seller, if the house is listed, they really need to work hard to get me to help them, if that makes any sense. But some guys out there are doing this very well, and they'll send postcards to listed properties, and they'll just ask the sellers, if you want a lease purchase, call me, okay? And many times the realtors don't mind, because now they'll get part of their commission instead of losing it, and they'll get the rest of it a year or two down the road if and when the house sells. But the guys I know that are doing that, if a realtor ever calls them and is upset and threatening them, they'll just drop the whole thing. It's not worth fighting. It's not worth arguing and trying to explain to the realtor what you're doing. But there's nothing in the law that says you as an investor can't send marketing to a listed property. Realtors can't do that. But you're an investor, there's nothing. So I know it's a little controversial. I don't do it, but I know a lot of investors that do it. Does that make sense? You realtors out there, do you understand? Did I say anything wrong?
Got yelled at about it, though.
You've gotten yelled at about it? Oh yeah, I mean, one of the negative things about being a realtor is you're under a lot more scrutiny and you have a lot more rules. Maybe that's a good thing, but sometimes that's frustrating, and you have to just learn. And if you're doing these as a realtor, the only difference is if you're going to do these as an investor, you need to disclose that you're a realtor, which isn't a big deal. Okay? All right, so we'll go through questions if we have more. Now you've got an option agreement with the seller. You're now going to flip that option agreement to a tenant buyer if and when you find one. All right, so I'm going to show you the contract I use. Well, okay, first, you advertise the house. Advertising, you want me to tell you how to best advertise a house? I don't even have a slide for it. It's so easy. You advertise it on Craigslist for rent to own, and you put some bandit signs in the neighborhood. All right? Now, Michael Jake has a very elaborate system of follow-up and building a tenant buyers list, and that's awesome. That does work. But just getting started, all you need to worry about is get some bandit signs out there and put some ads in Craigslist every 2 or 3 days. Would you agree, Michael? And rentals.com is a great place to go. And every city is different, so if you're targeting a different city, you want to go into that city and find out where most of the people are looking for rental homes there. There may be another website. I know some cities where the newspaper classified ad website is bigger than Craigslist. More people in that city will go to the newspaper classified ad website than they will Craigslist. Most cities, Craigslist is the biggest place to go and advertise. But as your business grows, you can start building a buyer's list, getting those tenant buyers into an autoresponder sequence, okay, that reminds them every few weeks, every month about your program, sends out new homes and stuff like that. You start building social media presence. So that's stuff that we do for our students. But for now, you start advertising a home, get pictures, get a video, put a Craigslist out there. I recommend Postlets or V-Flyer to create the flyer. That sends it out to 10 different sites, okay? Postlets or V-Flyer. I create the for rent and the for sale Postlet and V-Flyer. I do both, okay? And just get lots of good pictures, good videos, put them on YouTube, and put those videos into your Postlet and V-Flyer and start advertising on Craigslist. Every weekend, put some signs in the neighborhood. And if you don't find a tenant buyer in 2 to 4 weeks using those methods that we talked about at rentalhouses.com or rentals.com, something's wrong. Either the house is overpriced, or it needs too much work, or it's just in, it's in really bad shape. It's in a bad neighborhood. Does that make sense? So, you're now going to assign the option to the tenant buyer. You find a good tenant buyer, you're going to assign it to them. Now, hopefully you guys can see this. All right, I'll make it big. I do the paperwork 2 different ways, and I'm going to review both ways to you. I always get this mixed up. 6 1/2 dozen the other. Is that how you say it? I can never get that right. 6 1/2 dozen the other. So there's 2 ways I do it, and I go into detail in this in my course. It's just a different preference. I use an option to lease option, or I use just a regular option, lease option agreement. Okay. One I'm going to show you now is an option. I have the option to lease option the property if I find a tenant buyer, and the other one is I just sign a lease option agreement with the seller, and then I assign it. So let me explain how that works. In the option to lease option agreement, it's just a 1-page option agreement that gives me the right to lease option it if I find a tenant buyer. So I sign that with the seller, okay? And I'll show that to you here in a second. I sign that with the seller, and all the seller does is tell me what they want to walk away with on that house, okay? Then when I find a tenant buyer, I exercise that option with the seller, and then now it's like a sandwich lease option. I'm the tenant buyer and I'm subleasing it out. And then I go to the tenant buyer and I sign the lease option paperwork with them as me being the manager, the landlord, and them being the tenant. Okay? So now I have a contract with the tenant buyer, me being the landlord, they're the tenant buyer. I take that contract and then I assign it back to the seller, and then I'm out of the deal. Okay? That's one way to do it. The advantage to that is all I have to do now is give this seller a 1-page option agreement right here that they can sign online. I don't have to negotiate price. I don't have to ask them, okay, well, you want $150 for it, and okay, then I have to explain, I'm going to bump it up to $160, and I'll explain that in a second. This is just I've been doing it this way for years. It's just the easiest way to put this agreement on your website. They go and they sign it and they fill it out online. Yes?
I'm sorry, do you have this document online?
It's in my course. So they sign, it's just a 1-page option to lease option agreement. Now, the other way to do it is I sign an option agreement with the seller. And the way that works is it's a 4-page contract. The seller says they want $150, so I bump it up to $160, and I have to explain to them why I'm bumping it up. So I sign the lease option paperwork with the seller. They're the seller, I'm the tenant buyer. When I find a good tenant buyer, I just assign that to the tenant buyer, and then I'm out of the deal. Okay? So it removes a step. It's a little simpler. Okay? It's easier to explain. But there's just more paperwork involved up front to sign with the seller. Okay? It's more difficult you can't have that kind of an agreement just online that they can sign. Does that make sense? Because there you have to explain to them, all right, you want $150, but I'm going to bump it up to $160. So you're going to give them a contract that says the option price of this house will be $160. And then you have to explain to them how you're getting your money. So it's just a little different. I explain it both ways in the course with all the different paperwork, and you can decide which way you like. The second way I described it is the most common way that most people do it. Again, you sign the lease option paperwork with the seller as the tenant buyer. with the right to assign it, and then you assign that agreement to the tenant buyer and you're out of the deal. The first one is you sign an option to lease option with the seller. I hope I'm not getting too technical because it is really easy. It's not that hard. So I now, in the first way I showed, I have the option to lease option the property. When I find a tenant buyer, I sign the full, complete lease option agreement with that tenant buyer at the higher price, and then I assign that agreement back to the seller. Okay, so it's just a matter of who you're assigning it to. The first way, I'm assigning it to the seller, and the second way, you're assigning it to the tenant buyer. Okay. So the great thing about the first way, and this is the main way that I do it in my course, it's the option to lease option. So my agreement, the first thing that they fill out is this property information worksheet. And it's just tell me about the house, check these check marks, do you want dogs or cats? Give them a written property description of the property. And here it is. What's your minimum acceptable sales price? I want them to write down on there what's the minimum price that they want. What's your minimum acceptable monthly payment? What's your total monthly mortgage payment? Is the mortgage current? Are you living in the home? When will you be able to move? Is it okay to place a sign in the yard? And then they sign it saying that they're not in foreclosure right now. And then the mortgage is current. And then here's my option agreement. It's one page. It just says that, I won't go through all of this, but my option to make this contract valid is $1. Okay, I pay them $1 to make the option valid. And it just says on there that the intention is to assign, when I find a good tenant buyer, I'm going to sign a lease option agreement with that tenant buyer, and then I'm going to assign that to you, and I get to keep the option deposit money. Simple as that. The cool thing about this is there's no negotiating. All the seller does is tell me what they want. Okay? They just tell me what they want. Then I can bump it up to whatever I want. Sometimes I'll tell a seller, okay, you want $150, great. Well, how do you get paid? Well, I get paid from the tenant buyer. What does that mean? Well, I keep the option deposit. So how much do I get? Or sometimes they'll ask, well, how much do you get? Well, what does it matter? You want $150. Do you want more? Yeah, I want some more. Okay, what do you want? $155. Okay, I'll get you $155. Right? So they just write down what they want on there. When they say, well, why do you get to keep the option deposit? Well, that's the way I do it. Okay? Now, if you can keep the entire option deposit if you just want to do it on your own, that's fine. But I get paid for my services. Now, and then I sometimes go into the consulting pitch, you know. But so anyway, it's just a matter of I like the option to lease option agreement that I teach in my course because it's just simple. They can fill it out online, they sign it, send it to me. They tell me what the minimum is that they want. Then I start advertising it for a higher price, and I just remind the seller, look, you told me you wanted $150, and I'm going to get you $150. So when I set the price of the home, this is simple. They tell me they want $150, I'll bump it up 3%, maybe $4,000 or $5,000. Plus I'll bump it up another 3%, 2 to 3% to cover rent credits or the buyer's closing costs. So I'll set the option price at maybe $160. And if the seller says they want $1,000 a month in rent, that's what I advertise. I don't mark that up. I just advertise it for $1,000 a month. Okay? And when the rent credits, it's important to explain to the seller that you don't have to set aside that monthly rent, anything from that monthly rent every month, okay? Because that's just coming off of the top, okay? And that's a credit at closing if they pay the rent on time every month. So now the second way to do it, which is the more popular way, is with the let me see if I can make this bigger. Oh, anyway, this is the agreement. It's actually 5 pages long. Sometimes I do it this way, where the first thing that the seller signs is my 5-page lease option agreement. It's a lease purchase option agreement. It's not a separate lease. It's not a separate option agreement. It's just real simple, and it puts it all in one place. So the the agreement's going to be between the landlord and me. Okay? I'm the tenant buyer. And/or assigns tenant buyer. I'm the tenant buyer. I'm going to lease the property. It's going to be, I set the term to be 60 to 90 days away when it starts. I'm telling them, look, this lease option agreement starts in 60 to 90 days out, or sooner if I find somebody. But, and it'll terminate 3 years later, let's say, okay? And I explain what the rent's going to be. I put the rent credits in there. All right, now the option to purchase fee, I say, in consideration of the payment by the tenant buyer for the amount of, let's say the seller wants $150, I'm going to put on there $4,000 for the option deposit. Okay, $4,000, and the purchase price is going to be, if they want $150, I'm going to bump it up to $160. I'm going to put the option price on here of $160. Okay, do you see the difference between the two? All right. So the purchase price is going to be $160. And now in this, I have to do a little more explaining to the seller up front of how this works. Because they're going to say, wow, you want $160 for it. And most of the time it's not a problem. They just understand I have to mark it up. So if that's too much, if it makes it spread out too far, if it puts it out like 3 to 5 years, I'll tell them, well, you may need to lower your price so that we can maybe do it shorter. All right, so this option will expire in 24 months, 3 years. Okay, here's the assignment clause, the important assignment. The landlord hereby grants the tenant buyer, me, the right to assign this agreement to a third party as he or she sees fit, provided that the landlord-seller gives prior written consent for the assignment. However, the landlord-seller shall not unreasonably withhold such consent. In the event that this agreement is assigned to a third party, the tenant buyer shall be released from any further liability. I'll be released from any further liability. And by the way, the new tenant buyer cannot reassign this to somebody else. Assignment fee. This is the good part. In the event that this agreement is assigned, the tenant buyer will collect $4,000 as the assignment fee. Now, sometimes if it's a big enough deal and I'm trying to get a $10,000 option deposit, I may put 1 month's rent less in here. So if up there I put $10,000 assignment fee, I may put down that I'm going to collect $8,000 as my assignment fee here. Do you see? So this says right here, the seller sees this, the buyer sees this, everybody sees this. In the event that this agreement is assigned, the tenant buyer will collect $4,000 as an assignment fee, which shall be still credited towards the non-refundable option fee due to the seller landlord as previously provided for in this agreement. If the option to purchase is not exercised for any reason, there will be no refund of the option consideration money. So if the tenant buyer doesn't buy the house, nobody will get that money refund. So this agreement is non-exclusive and doesn't prevent the seller from advertising or selling the house on their own. I also give the tenant buyer that I ultimately assign this to the right to extend this another 12 months if they want. One big question that comes up a lot is, what if the tenant buyer can't buy the house? What if the house doesn't appraise? Okay, I never evict the tenant buyers if they can't buy the house. Okay, a lot of investors have gotten a bad rap because they're just into the business of churning and burning. All right, they just want to get the next tenant buyer in there, kick the old one out so they can get another option deposit. If they can't buy the house, that's too bad. I don't allow that. The tenant buyers, if they can't buy the house for whatever reason, they can extend it another 12 months if they want. But they do have to pay an additional option deposit, which go towards their future down payment. Okay, so sometimes if the house won't appraise, the seller can either lower their price or just give the tenant buyer more time. But I don't allow my contracts, I don't allow them to evict the tenant buyer if the tenant buyer can't get a loan for whatever reason. They may have to pay an additional deposit to extend it, but it's just not fair, in my opinion, and you could get in trouble potentially, even though it's in the contract. It just doesn't look good when you hear in the news some tenant buyer complaining that you're kicking them out because they've paid their rent on time every month, but they just can't buy the house. Does that make sense? That's one reason why in Texas lease options have such a bad rap, and why there's unique laws that affect lease options in Texas. because there was a time when a lot of big wealthy investors were taking advantage of a lot of poor immigrants, and it was really bad. So anyway, this explains the closing costs. So this is a big contract. It's 5 pages. So this isn't something that you can just put onto your website that the sellers can sign and fill out. So you can just look at both ways that I teach in the course, figure out which one's better for you, what you feel more comfortable with. Honestly, the second way, this longer 5-page agreement, is sometimes easier to explain, okay, to the seller, what you're doing. The option to lease option agreement is easier to fill out online, but sometimes there's a little extra step involved there. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on that. It's important, but really, when you do this, it's easy. And I'm telling you, this is, I'll get to your question in a sec. This is so much easier than regular wholesaling, in my opinion. Now, I talk to a lot of regular wholesalers who would disagree, but I think these are the easiest deals to do for many reasons. Yes?
When you get somebody into the lease option agreement, you check all their credit and whatnot, do you get them into credit restoration if they need it, and then for some reason at this point when they say, well, I still can't afford or I still can't buy it, and you extend it, you make sure that they're still doing it?
The question is, do I put them in credit repair, and if they still can't buy it, what do I do? Yeah, I put them all into credit. It's a requirement in my contract that they have to go into a credit repair, and I list on the contract which company they have to go through. I'll recommend some, but maybe they want to go through their own, so they have to go through credit repair. It's part of the contract. And if they can't get a mortgage because their credit's not, there's many reasons why they couldn't. I remind the sellers, look, your house may go down in value. There may be something wrong with your house that they find out later. They don't want to buy it because they didn't realize there was foundation issues or whatnot. So, but if they don't buy the house and they decide to move, they forfeit their option deposit. There's no question about that. That's very clear. They lose their option deposit. But if they can't buy the house because their credit's not fixed yet or the house didn't appraise, they still can extend the lease option to give them more time. I always make that the case, yes.
Would you collect that extension fee or no?
The seller would collect the extension fee. And that extension fee, the additional option consideration, goes towards their future down payment. Yes?
How many times would you extend it? You said 12 months.
Well, I extend, if it was it's up to the seller, number one. But I'd recommend to the seller to keep on, I remind the seller, what are you going to do? What are your options? You got somebody in here who's taking care of the home, who's paying the mortgage every month, you're paying it down, and you could go ahead and kick them out if you want, but then it's going to be vacant. You're going to have to go in and clean it up a little bit. It's going to be vacant another 3 to 6 months while you're trying to sell it. Most sellers, they want to keep that tenant buyer in there because they've been paying the rent on time, they've been taking care of it, and they don't want to put it back on the market.
Does this contract give you an out if you, for some reason, don't find a tenant buyer at that point?
Yes, it does, because remember at the very beginning, I set the option to start in 60 to 90 days, right?
Does that mean, though, in 90 days you start making a payment?
No, I'll cancel the agreement at that time. That's a beautiful thing about options. You can cancel it whenever you want. Now, I forfeit my option deposit, which is $1, okay? So, you have to put some money up as consideration, but, and the seller, I make my options very flexible, so the seller can cancel it anytime, I can cancel it at any time. Sometimes what happens is if I have a house and I haven't been able to find anybody in a couple months, I'll just tell the seller, hey, if you want, we can just advertise it for rent, and I'll keep 1 month's rent, and I'll just find a regular tenant. So then I assign my lease to the tenant buyer. Does that make sense? And I'll keep 1 month's rent. It's better than nothing. One more question? Yes, sir.
The first contract you showed us, the one you have, the one page on your website, option, the lease option, you're assigning that back to the seller once you find a buyer, correct?
Well, no. What I'm doing is I have the, I sign the option, lease option agreement with the seller. When I find a tenant buyer, I sign a whole new contract with them. It's a lease, it's a separate lease, it's a separate option agreement, and I'm the landlord in that. And then I assign that to the seller. Now let me show you some of the assignment forms here. I have what's called an authorization to assign, where again, the seller is saying, all right, I'm authorizing you to assign it to somebody else, to this specific person. They don't have to sign that. They've already given me the authorization to sign in the first thing they signed with me, but I'm just doing this again to kind of make it more clear and more plain that they're accepting this tenant buyer that I found. Okay? The other thing I have them sign is this is the actual assignment form that says, all right, I'm assigning this contract between me and so to so and so. That's all it is. And it just, it's really good. The second page of this is the seller release and acknowledgement. This just clarifies again. I like clarifying things 2 or 3 times. That I'm keeping that $73.50 on this deal, okay? And you're still going to give this back to them as their option deposit, okay? And the seller understands that they're accepting this person, and they're agreeing that the property is in good standing and the mortgage is current. By the way, I use a title company or an escrow company to collect the rents every month and pay the mortgage, okay? The title company also will check to make sure that the property is not over encumbered when I first get it under contract. That means there's not $500,000 of liens on this property that we're trying to sell for $150,000. Does that make sense? And so it says also that you're satisfied with this agreement. Somebody asked about inspection. That was a good question. Yeah, I make the tenant buyer get an inspection on the home before they move in. Okay, professional inspection or themselves, but they will waive their right if they don't get a professional inspection, because I want to make sure everything's out on the table. So the seller will do a seller's disclosure statement. They'll fill out a seller's disclosure statement that says everything they are aware of in the property, and then the tenant buyer will also go into it with a professional inspection. That way, if there's something wrong, they can address it before the tenant buyer moves in. Okay, sometimes. This is a great strategy, by the way, you can do this for junkers, for properties that need work. Now, how would you do that? I've done this several times, and it works awesome. The seller, I'll tell you an example. It was a house it was a condo, a 3-bedroom condo. These things used to sell for $100,000 at the height of the market, and now they're selling for maybe $50,000, fixed up. Okay, investors are buying these things at like $500 to $1,000. It's not in a great area. Maybe you could sell it for $5,000 to an investor who to go in and fix it up. But this one in particular, it was totally gutted, and there's no flooring, there's no kitchen, the bathrooms were a mess. Somebody had started the rehab, but all they got done was the tear out. They didn't do anything else after that. But the investor who had the home called me and said he still owed $25,000 on the house. Okay, he still owed $25,000. He wanted me to buy it. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that, because I couldn't even wholesale that thing for $5,000 to an investor. But he was stuck. His payments were only $350 a month. Okay, and he didn't have enough money to finish the rehab. And even if he would have finished the rehab and got it nice, he wouldn't have made any money on selling it. So what I did is I said, well, we could do a lease purchase on this thing. Well, wait a minute, Joe. How can you do a lease purchase if it's not even fixed? What we did is we don't have a pad of paper up here, so I'll just write down these numbers. I'll try to get them right. So he owed $25,000 on the property, and his payments were $350 a month. Okay. So I said, let's advertise it as a handyman special lease option. Okay. And so what we did is we figured out how much more work needs to be done on it. And he said $20,000, approximately about $20,000. All right, and said let's advertise this house as a handyman special, work for equity. You get let's say $20,000. You get $20,000 equity or credit at closing if you fix this house up, Mr. Tenant Buyer, on your own. Okay. And then I said we'll set the rent at $350. By the way, 3 bedrooms in this area are renting for $800 to $1,000. So we're going to advertise rent of $350 Do you think I'm going to get a lot of calls on that property? All right. So I said, now I have to make a minimum of $3,000 on this deal to make it worth my time. He said, fine. And I said, we're going to need to make this really attractive to get a lot of calls on it. Let's do 100% rent credits for 3 years. All right? So somebody get a calculator, take 350 times 12 times 3 years. $350 times 12 months times 3 years. $12,600, okay? So the seller owes $25,000. They just want to get out of their loan. So take $25,000 plus my profit of $3,000. Somebody write this down. $25,000 plus $3,000 plus the rent credits of $12,600 plus the $20,000 work for equity credit that we're going to give them. What is that? $60,600, right? You didn't even have a calculator. All right, so you now set the option. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. You take the, okay, let's just say $63,000. I'm going to set the option price at $63,000. Remember, these condos were selling for $100,000 5 years ago. Handyman special, work for equity. You put the work in, we'll get a $20,000 credit at closing. We'll knock $20,000 off the price. The rent is only $350 a month, and you're going to get 100% of your rent back if and when you buy the house in 3 years. You get 100% of your rent back, and you have to finish the work before you move in. See, and I made sure that they understood they had to get the permits, they had to get licensed contractors and all that stuff. My phone rang off the hook on that deal. It's fantastic. The seller loved it. So what happens now? We found a good tenant buyer. He put $3,000 down. I kept that. Sorry for you on the video. I just hit the mic. So I keep the $3,000. The tenant buyer now has this property. They're controlling this property on a lease option on some incredible terms. My point in all this is if you have a junker, okay, no investor is going to buy that thing. There's just too much work. It's too high priced. Okay? But a tenant buyer would buy that if the terms are right. So if the price isn't right, you can get terms. So whenever you're talking to sellers, always be thinking about how you can make that deal attractive and marketable to your end buyer. Whether you're doing traditional wholesaling or wholesaling lease options, always think about how can I make this deal attractive to my end buyers. So it's real simple. I got some really, really good terms. Would you agree? Those are good terms for a tenant buyer? I got flooded with calls. The tenant buyer, we found a guy who was a contractor. He already had a bunch of materials. He came in, got the permits, and I wasn't managing any of that. That was between the seller and them, right? So he got the permits, he came in and he fixed it all up. They moved in and they're still leasing it out. They're paying $350 a month to get a 3-bedroom condo. It's a great deal. Now the seller, he's in a great position now because what if they default or what if they don't buy the house and he gets it back? It's in way better condition than it was when I had no problem convincing him that this was a good way to go, right? And the other thing is I could have stayed in the middle and maybe done that deal myself, stayed in the deal, but it was in an area I wasn't interested in. I just wanted to make my quick $3,000 and get out, okay? It worked perfect. I've done that several different times. I always teach you should go after the nice homes in the nice areas, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But sometimes you're going to get sellers who come to you with these junkers in rough areas. Well, you can flip them as a handyman special lease option. And the great thing about it is, if we wouldn't have been able to find somebody, it's no skin off my back, right? I'm not under any obligations to make any payments on that house. I'm not going to be fixing anything up. And the seller, they can cancel at any time. It's not my responsibility. It's not my problem, you know? So, anybody of you like that? Yeah. That's awesome. I know you don't have any houses that need any work here in Colorado Springs. Is the nickname the slums of Colorado Springs? Is that what they call it out here? I was joking with people. Do you even have bad areas in Colorado Springs?
You just can't tell all the time until you move in, and then there's.
You just, yeah. It's beautiful out here. Okay. Now I know I covered a lot in that paperwork, and I didn't show you everything. Yes, real quick.
Did you say in that 5-page option version that the seller can, like you said, the seller can sell at any time? They don't
Yeah.
have to stay with the lease option?
Well, the seller can, if they sell it or lease it before I find a tenant buyer and I assign my contract, they can cancel it anytime.
Oh, but
Yeah.
as soon as they're under that
Michael,
lease option,
can I have a water, please? Yeah, as soon as the,
they are not allowed to
Right.
sell underneath the buyer.
well, they can sell it to another investor, but it's just required by law. Thank you. To keep the house, the tenant they have to fulfill the terms of the tenant that's in there. Good question. Okay. So that's the paperwork. I cover that in a lot of detail in my course, and you can look at the different ways to do it. You may find that one way is simpler than the other. Sometimes when I'm doing a deal where a realtor is involved, I prefer the second way, okay? Not the option to lease option. I prefer the other way because it's just easier to explain. Mr. Realtor, look, I'm a tenant buyer on this property. I may assign it, I may not. If the numbers work, I'm going to stay in the middle. If the numbers don't work, I'm going to assign it. Okay, so it's just a little easier sometimes to explain to a realtor when they're involved. Okay, so you understand I'm advertising the house now. I had it under an option. An option lets you control the property without owning it. Now that I control it, I can advertise it. That's why you don't have to be a realtor to do these deals, because you're a principal in this. But it is a little gray area sometimes on advertising this house. So that's why I recommend you to get your license or partner with a realtor to help you advertise the home for you. Now, if you bring on a realtor, it's important to understand that realtor represents you. Okay? That realtor doesn't represent the seller. When I'm advertising a house to lease option, I'm hiring a realtor to represent me and advertise the house for me. Does that make sense? So by the way, when I have a realtor working for me, I tell them this is how I do it. I don't let the realtor tell me that we have to use our paperwork, we have to do it this way, okay? If they're not comfortable with using my paperwork, then I say, that's fine, I'll go find somebody else, okay? Now, the realtor may have me, they may want me to sign some paperwork on each deal that their broker says they have to sign. That's fine, some kind of listing agreement or some kind of commission agreement or whatever. That's fine. But I'm going to use, I like my contracts better than the realtor's contracts. And so if a realtor, and I don't even know, if a realtor is doing their own deals, right, they don't have to use the realtor's approved contracts, right? You can use your own contracts. But if you're doing this, so just make sure you explain it up front with your realtor if you're partnering with them on this. And I love this part. You forget it and get paid. I have a title company and an attorney. I say close the deal in air quotes, because you're not really closing it, you know. You don't close the deal until 2 years down the road if and when they get a mortgage. But I want to make a title company. This helps you with credibility. You know, it helps you when you're talking to the seller or the tenant buyer. Hey, just send everything over to my attorney. Okay, they'll handle all the paperwork. It helps protect you. It helps give you more credibility. And so I have a title company that makes sure that the mortgage is current, and they make sure that the house isn't over encumbered with a bunch of liens. And the company I use, I give access to my students. And the reason why I don't give it out when I speak is I just talked to this guy. His name is Angelo. I talked to him yesterday. He's like, Joe, your students keep on calling me and I'm not getting any work done. So I'm real careful on who I give their information out to, because they just get flooded with calls. They only want to work with you if you have a deal under contract. So, but they will answer questions, but I'm working on right now recording an interview with him that I'll give to my students. So anyway, they'll also pull the rent every 2 weeks, every month from the tenant's account and pay the mortgage. That way you don't have to worry about 2 years down the road you getting a frantic call from the tenant saying, I just got a foreclosure notice, I've been paying the rent every month and the seller hasn't been paying the mortgage. Okay. Real quick, yeah.
They charge a fee for that?
Yeah, they charge a fee. The title company charges, the one I use, they charge $500 to do all the paperwork. And the other big advantage, and they charge $50 a month to withdraw the rent every month and pay the mortgage. So if a seller says they want $1,000 a month in rent, I just bump up the rent to $1,050. Or I'll ask the seller to cover half of it, so I'll bump it up to $1,025. Right? So the other thing that's really important with using a title company is you want the tenant buyer to make there's 2 seats right up here at the very front. Don't worry, that's all right. One of the big advantages to having a tenant buyer make the check out to the escrow company, their option deposit at the very beginning, is it helps underwriting a year or 2 later when they're going to get a mortgage. So the underwriter's not looking at this cashier's check made out 2 years ago to Joe Blow investor. And they're going, well, who's this investor guy? This is a contract between the seller and the buyer, so this doesn't. So if you have the option deposit check made out to an escrow company, it's just like any other transaction that happens today, where the buyer will make a check out to some title company. Okay, so it's really important. It makes it easier for your mortgage broker to get that tenant buyer financed if the option deposit check is made out to a escrow company. Does that make sense? Yes.
And what's the attorney charging you?
The attorney that does this charges me $500. Now, in my opinion, it's money well spent, and I only pay them out of when I get paid. Okay, but they're handling all the paperwork for me. Okay, so with this guy I use, he's told me, Joe, you can have me send all the paperwork to the tenant buyer, or you just send it to the tenant buyer and send it to me after it gets signed. It doesn't matter. So that's what I do. Yes, Michael.
Is your state an attorney closing state or title?
My state in Missouri is a title company closing state. So if you have what is Colorado? A title company. Okay. Some states are attorneys. Really, it's attorneys who work at title companies. Usually, attorneys own title companies. So, but it just helps with your credibility. I've lost a deal one time. I had a tenant buyer. I was meeting them at Panera. We call it St. Louis Bread Company in St. Louis. It used to be called St. Louis Bread Company. They call it Panera now. So they had their $5,000 cashier's check made out to me. I have an office in my house, so I always meet clients and investors and students at Starbucks or bread company. And the tenant buyer said, well, why are we meeting here? Why don't you meet in your office? Well, my office is at my house. Do you have any business cards? I forgot to bring business cards with me. No, I'm sorry, I left them at home. Here's all the paperwork, let's talk about it and review it. And they said, well, we don't feel comfortable. Like we're at this restaurant, you don't have any business cards, I'm just making this check out to you. I don't know who you are. Do you own this house? They started asking questions. I was like, great. So they walked away. They literally got up and walked away. And so what I started doing after that point was making sure I had business cards with me. Whenever I'm meeting with a tenant buyer or a seller, I always give them a business card. It makes me look more professional. I have lots of testimonials on my website. And then if it's a big deal, I'll meet the seller or the tenant buyer at one of my friends' offices who's a realtor. And I'll just meet them in their office, or I'll meet them at the title company. But the title company I use is in Ohio. So, I could, if I tried hard, I've tried this with a couple different companies in St. Louis, and they've told me they'll do it. But then when it comes down to actually doing it, it's like pulling out teeth. They don't understand how we're supposed to do it. So I just found this guy in Ohio that does this for investors all over the country, and so he does it for me. Plus, I can now tell all my students all over the country, hey, just use this guy. He'll do it for you. And he's reviewed my paperwork and is totally fine with it. He's an attorney as well. Yes.
The buyers wire their option funds and everything to the title company.
The buyers wire, it's a cashier's check, but they'll make it out to the title company. And then they'll disperse it to whoever it's supposed to go to.
How much did you pay the realtor? Did you say 1 month's rent?
How much do I pay the realtors? It depends. I think there's 2 answers to your question. If the seller already has their house listed with the realtor, I don't care what the realtor gets paid. That's between seller and their agent. They have to figure and work that out. If I have a realtor helping me advertise and market the home, I'll usually pay the realtor $500, or maybe 25% of whatever profit I make, depending on how much work they're doing for me. Now, I've had somebody help me before. I was paying them 40%, but they were literally doing everything. I wasn't doing anything. One question here.
I was wondering what your success rate is on tenant buyers who actually purchase, or do you even track that because you're kind of out of the deal at that point?
I don't really track it that much. It's a tricky question for various reasons. I've been doing this now almost 4 years, okay? And what has the market done in the last 4 years? It's gone down. So almost every house that I've done a lease option on, the value is less than it was when they started it. But not a big deal, really, okay? What happens usually, the seller will call me up, hey, they can't buy the house. The seller knows what's going on. The house is worth less today than it was a year or two ago. What do I do? Just give them more time. Okay, the tenant buyer doesn't want to leave, right? The seller doesn't want to have to come to closing with them any more money, so they'll just extend it another 12 months. Now, my success rate is really good when I know that I need to get somebody to buy that house in 6 to 12 months, okay? Because I'm going to be much more strict on who I accept into that program. So if the seller says, I have to sell this thing in 12 months, I'm going to take somebody who I feel is very close, just needs about 6 to 12 months, okay? And I'm going to make sure they get into a great credit repair company and work with a really good mortgage broker, and they're really involved. Sometimes in that case, I will not let them extend the contract. I'll say, look, Mr. Tenant Buyer, you understand this seller has to sell it in 12 months, and if you don't buy it, you're going to have to move. Do you understand that? And I make them sign a disclosure or whatever. So, but most of the time, the sellers, they understand the state of the market, and they don't have any other options. And they just want somebody in there that'll take care of the house and hopefully buy it. Does that make sense? Because I tell the sellers, the worst thing that can happen is they don't buy it, but they've been taking care of the home, they've been paying the rent. Well, that's actually not the worst thing that could happen. They could trash the property. You know what? That reminds me. Let me show you something. This is the first thing that I have the seller sign. Risks. The optioner, the seller, understands that there is risk in leasing property. Tenants may not pay their rent on time. They may not pay their rent at all. And they may not buy the house. The tenants may damage the property. The seller understands that it is important to have their property inspected at least once a month. The seller has been encouraged to start the eviction process the day their rent is late. The seller will indemnify, hold harmless, and release me from any and all liability if the tenant buyer has to be evicted, damages the property, or does not buy the house. The seller understands that Joe McCall is not a realtor, and this is not a listing agreement of any kind. So I explained to them right up front, look, this is the worst that could happen, okay?